Good morning, all. I can see people are joining the meeting now, or the webinar now. We're going to get started pretty promptly. So as people come in the room, I'll kick off with the acknowledgement of country. So welcome today to this webinar on delivering climate resilience, where we're joined by our global lead, David Symons, who I'll introduce you to later. I'd like to commence by acknowledging that at WSP, we acknowledge that every project works and takes place on the lands of our First Nations people. And we recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first scientists and engineers, and we pay respects to their elders past and present. I'm joining today from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, but I know that we have people joining from all around this big country. So today we're going to start off with just some brief housekeeping in terms of how the session's going to run. So thanks all for joining. We really value your feedback, but you're not going to be able to speak. So your microphone has been muted. If you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A function. And then if we have time, we'll get to your question or potentially follow up after this webinar. And with that in mind, the webinar today is being recorded, and everybody who's registered for this session will be able to get a copy. Will be sent a copy, I think, in the next day or so from our team here at WSP. So with that said, I might just we're going to start by running several polls, and that's really just to get us all into the room and thinking about climate resilience. Before I do that, though, I did want to just introduce the topic that we'll be talking about today. So WSP, big global business working on climate resilience and just resilience more generally on our projects around the world. So this does include projects at all stages of the design life, from planning phases through to operational phases, as well as working with our clients around just looking at how they're impacted by climate change more generally from their operations. We know that climate within the next 100 years is going to get more extreme, and the projects we're designing now will be within that environment. So it is really important that we start to think about what we're doing now to plan and allow the capacity for our assets and infrastructure to work within a climate change world. Every dollar that we're spending now on all these wonderful capital works projects is dollar that we could actually use to contribute to building resilience in our communities. And I think, though, we would all acknowledge that whilst there are a number of projects and clients that we're working with that are doing this really well, there's also a lot of opportunities that are being missed and probably processes that we could work on better. So with that in mind, we have wanted to have a bit more of an open discussion around how we can actually work towards getting more consistent and stronger resilient outcomes in our projects. And the other part is really to think about how we can also start to acknowledge where we have those gaps as well. A big part of building adaptive capacity is understanding what the capacity is as well within our systems, and then passing that on to our clients and operators of infrastructure. I think a really good example of where that's playing out at the moment is the regional drought resilience plans that are being completed around the country. WSP has been involved in a number of these, and that's an example of where communities can actually do a lot to start to plan for the impacts of climate change and more frequent drought within their communities, so that, you know, when these events happen, they're sort of more ready and able and have capacity to handle those as well. And the other thing that's probably quite relevant to Australia at the moment is the legislation that's making its way through our government around mandatory disclosure of climate risk. And that will start to impact a number of our bigger companies and moving through to smaller companies and operations over the next few years. So really trying to acknowledge, understand and plan. So that's just thinking about what we're sort of the environment we're working within in Australia. We thought we'd do a little poll now just to get you all in the room. So we've got a series of 3 polls. They're going to come up, I believe, this is new Zoom technology for me, but I believe they're going to come up as polls within your Zoom. And so we'll just take a few seconds with each of those, if you could actually just respond to the poll. So the first poll, and you should be able to do that straight away, the first poll is really thinking about climate change risk assessments. And the people in the room today is how many people have actually been involved in those, either maybe within your organisation or on a project specifically. So do you have awareness of that? Have you been involved in that? That's just us trying to understand, what sort of amount of people are actually involved in this process at the moment. It's not unexpected, I think, that with a group, broader group like this that's actually engaging on a climate change resilience webinar, that we would have people who are involved in those. But it is quite interesting that there is still a number of people who may not have been involved or are not really sure of what's going on there. So we might just go to the next question now, which is really thinking about the challenges. I'm not sure if we can move that one across. Yep, okay. Do I press share results? Hang on, sorry, this is a technology issue on my side. Let me do that. And I can see if everybody can see those results. Okay. And I think, can we go to the next question? Great. Okay. So the second question is really thinking about what the main challenges people on this call are seeing around adopting or incorporating climate change resilience thinking into projects. So some of the ones we were thinking of when we hear is around governance, but finance is a big issue. Like, how much does it cost to have a more resilient and plan for resilience in your infrastructure? We get a lot of feedback around standards not being clear around climate resilience, or what targets, operational targets, might need to be achieved in a climate change world. Time, always the big bugbear of any project. And maybe just, the other things, and maybe we'll understand a little bit more about what they may be. So again, thank you all. Money, yes, money is certainly one of the ones we hear a lot of, and standards as well. So sort of quite consistent with what we're seeing as well. All right. And then if we go to the final question or poll, which is around just trying to understand your organisation, maybe the way you work on projects as well, depending on what your role is, readiness to address climate change impacts. So do you feel like you guys have got it, really prepared, maybe mostly prepared, or are we sort of coming quite concerned about how prepared we are within your organisation, reviewing that may be an environment that maybe not as well prepared? So yeah, I sort of reflect on that. I'd say from WSP's perspective, I feel we're moderately prepared. We've got good skills, but we're still learning, and we're still trying to communicate that more broadly through to all our projects and all the different types of work that we're doing. So I'd say there's a big opportunity gap there for us to work through. All right, so that's the last poll that we've got today. And this is probably a good spot for me to introduce David, and then maybe just get a little bit of feedback on the poll before he does a short presentation. So David Symons is the other lovely face you can see on the call today. And so I think I can just minimize that so we should all be able to see the presentation again. David is WSP's Future Ready Global Leader, and he's also Director of Earth and Environment with WSP in the UK. And whilst David leads our Future Ready, he also developed Future Ready for WSP, which is our program that really is our sort of key strategic thinking that we bring to all the projects that we work on. And that's part of the driving influence for WSP Australia, making our commitment to halve our carbon in our designs and advice by 2030. A number of regions, including WSP UK, have also made that commitment as well. David's been with our business for 30 years, and he works across lots of different aspects of sustainability and climate change consulting. Some of the work that we often are talking to him about is his work with UK National Highways, work with Walmart and IKEA, and he also sort of jumps around to lots of different government bodies, helping on projects around sectors, including water as well. So lots of different things he knows about. He gets around a lot around the country and around Europe and more globally. So he gets to learn a lot about what WSP is doing around the world. And I think that gives him really extraordinary insight into what works really well, and to share that more broadly with us all today. So Dave's going to run through a brief presentation, and then at the end we should have about 25 minutes for questions. But just handing over to you, David. Any reflections on those polls?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be with you. I'm in a very wet Brisbane this morning. which makes a change from the previous times I've been in Brisbane, where it's been very, very hot. So nice to be with you. The topic of this webinar is delivering climate resilience beyond the risk assessment. So I suppose the first piece, I suppose, that leapt off the page for me, Bernadette, was the 30% of participants on the call who said they hadn't done a risk assessment. I mean, that's the first step. If you've not done a risk assessment, then action one from this session is just go and do, or make sure you track down a climate risk assessment. It is just the starter for just understanding what does climate mean for your organization. So that's a start. The topic for this is then, once you've done that, how do you get beyond that? If you just flip to the next slide, please. I think, just setting the context. This is not my quote. This is a quote from a federal government document, and you don't have to be a incredible climate scientist to recognize that Australia, and indeed right across the world, has and is facing significant climate change, and we are in the foothills of that. And regular climate events like El Nino and the like right now are sort of part of the exacerbation of that. But we know that climate change is a significant thing. What I want to do in this short presentation is draw out 5 lessons that I've drawn from across our organization, and really based on 3 things. One, the work that we have done on integrating climate resilience into the schemes that we're working on with our clients, and also specialist pieces of work around climate resilience planning. Bernadette mentioned national highways. We've been working with them, but also to some of the global water companies and the like as well. So that's area 1. Area 2, of course, is, as you would expect for a global organization, we've published our own TCFD risk assessment, published our second one last year, given that that's an annual reporting cycle as well. And then thirdly, based on our own thought leadership, bringing that combination of science, engineering, and management consultancy, which really then brings our sort of expertise from the risk assessment, from the science, but then really then translating that through to, okay, what are the practical actions that that organizations can be taking in response to that? And that's probably the sort of the key area, is that beyond the risk assessment. Is the risk assessment is wonderful, but it's the actions that really count. So next slide, please. I think probably lesson 1 is one just overarching, that generally our experience of the risk assessment process and the work that has been done, if we as we look and benchmark at the climate risk assessments that have been done by infrastructure organizations or organizations across the world, is generally they are great at looking at the individual risks. So the risk from water shortages, the risks from much hotter temperatures, the risks from a 1 in 100 year flood becoming much more frequently. What our research, we did some work with the UK Committee on Climate Change as part of the 3rd climate risk assessment that published last year, was that while that piece was quite robust, generally interdependencies of climate risk are probably often, or they are often, underappreciated and underassessed. So for example, that would include things like electricity outages due to storms. If you're running an electrical based transport network, that becomes a critical point for the transport network. And so, just as one example, we will see that the reliance, the recoverability of the electricity network, as nations, including Australia, move to a fossil-free society become utterly critical. You've got to have a robust electricity network in order for that to be resilient, or plans for backups, or more than one critical supply point. And if you just want an example of that, this is Stockholm in Sweden. This has now been resolved, but if I just give you an example of this, we did some work with Stockholm a few years ago. The city was concerned about rising lake levels from Lake Mälaren in the due to more rapid snow melt up in the watershed that feeds into Lake Mälaren, and there's a series of lock gates at the end of the lake, which were going to be out of capacity, and so anticipating that lake levels would rise by about 3/4 of a metre in certain circumstances. Now, the first piece that we were asked to look at was, well, what does that mean in terms of road flooding and things such as that? So we addressed that, but the most important risk that we identified from this study was that there was a particular electricity substation that was at the lakeside that would be knocked out by this rising lake level, and that was the one electricity substation that fed the city's drinking water intake. That has now been resolved, like I say, but this is just the sort of interdependencies that become utterly critical. And so just really making sure in that assessment that the consequence analysis and the like are being considered becomes utterly critical beyond just the individual risks. Slide 2, please. The next piece is when we are building new, then a recognition that many design standards, and these are things that WSP often work to, are robust. They've absolutely been designed from a cost and a quality point of view, but generally our experience of standards are that they are slower moving than the future that we are expecting. And there has been study after study that has been produced that just quite simply provides the clear outset that today's design codes and design standards are not reflective of the climate reality that we are expecting. And if I give you just a rail example from the UK, we've had a lot of rainfall over the last month or so. There was a flood storage basin that had been built in the West Country near Bristol, not by WSP, I should say, completed just 5 years ago. In the storms that we had in February, that flood storage basin, even though it had only been built 5 years ago, was overtopped. The railway line was out of action for the best part of a week while floodwaters receded. That was built to design standards, and so making sure that for all of the infrastructure, if you're an infrastructure authority, if you're a standards agency and the like, just absolutely having a clear thought process and making sure that as part of the standards revision process that those are up to date and they anticipate reality or can flex to future reality becomes really important. Next slide, please. I think the other piece that is just important to recognize is from our work and looking at conclusions from other infrastructure agencies is also just not a criticism, but just a recognition that infrastructure and also the private sector will usually underinvest in climate resilience measures in a normal world, partly because they are expensive, partly because 1 in 100 years or whatever only becomes important in 1 in 100 years or when that happens. And we're generally naturally tending towards optimism rather than anything else. And so that there needs to be a mechanism beyond the risk assessment then say, okay, let's be systematic about this in our planning process. And I suppose the important thing also to recognize in this area is that probably most of the resilience investment that is needed in infrastructure is retrofitting existing infrastructure, because that's still most of the infrastructure in Australia that is going to be there in 25 years, as well as, of course, if we're building new, just making sure that we're building that for that future resilience, and that it's either has resilience built in now, or it's easily retrofitted, and it's planned to be retrofitted as well. So yeah, planning for that. And then next slide, please. A framework and an approach beyond the risk assessment that we're talking to a large number of infrastructure organizations about now is really how to integrate climate resilience for our infrastructure clients into the regulatory cycle. And this is really where we address those those conversations around finance, and we have a grown-up conversation about, look, let's be really clear about what climate resilience means. Now, I have to say, I don't see many infrastructure organizations actually concluding through on this yet, because this is quite a new concept. Even doing climate risk assessments is a is something which is a start, but quite often they're sciencey risk assessments where they less necessarily translate to is then actually into, okay, so where does that fit into our regulatory investment process and investments as well. So this is a concept that we are advocating. It's part of our future ready innovation and future ready thinking. And really it goes right back to aligning and understanding, first of all, most rated industries, if that's your industry, have performance-based targets. And if you're, I suppose, think about that from a private sector basis as well, you will know what are the definitions of success in your organization as well. So then look forwards into call it, 3-year processes if you're your business planning cycle, or look to 5, look to 10 if you are, or 15 if you are a regulated industry on 5-year investment cycles. And just think carefully beyond that risk assessment about how will those performance standards, how will compliance and meeting that change in a business as usual world. So population might grow, for example, infrastructure might age, for example, in a business as usual world. So before you even put a climate change lens over your performance standards, you will know as part of strategic planning just what will happen to those performance standards in our business as usual world. And then once you have that, that then gives the opportunity to then overlay what does climate change mean, and how will that affect those performance standards. And that then is the basis to then say, okay, well, look, we look like we're quite good for the next 5 years, but in, let's say, for example, years 5 to 10, then we start having some really significant challenges with meeting those performance standards because of what we are expecting might be a climate changed future. If you go out to 10, 15 years, of course, it's difficult to see. So you might have a handful of realities, maybe on a RCP 8.5 scenario. I really hope we don't have that, but maybe something like a 4.5 scenario, which is one which is I think one which is a bit more realistic. But you've then got your clarity that's aligned to performance-based standards, and then that allows you, and as part of your regulatory planning, to have the conversations with your customers, with your regulators, with your key stakeholders, in terms of, if we need to keep those performance standards in future regulatory investment periods, what are we going to need to do? What are the specific projects or specific things that we will need to customers to be doing more on in order to still keep hitting those performance standards? That then allows a conversation with regulators and with customers about, okay, well, if that's going to cost us, is it reasonable to say that will cost $2 more on your water bill a day, or on your transport, your rail ticket it will cost you this, or on your road price, or the like. But it is an informed conversation that you can then have with regulators. Conversely, if the conversation then is, that's astronomically expensive and we're not going to do that, that then allows a parallel conversation in terms of, okay, well, how do we change performance standards? Can we flex those, and what works? And it is just that process of aligning the risk assessment with your strategy and with your regulatory settlement. And that is the piece that I think is probably, if you take nothing away from this webinar, that's the thing that we would be advocating, and is a critical combination of management, consultancy, science, and engineering as well. And then my last slide on this is just on governance. So governance is like everything, is critical for delivery. So just making absolutely sure that we are clear about who is doing what, making sure that there is governance from top to bottom. Who is the executive? Who has overall in charge? What are the specific programs and projects that need to happen across the organization? How are we going to track those? What's the work program for them? Who is in charge of delivering the finance for them? How do we keep that on track? And that's the same for each of us in our organizations, but also across the wider state infrastructure, the wider value chain that the businesses operate within as well. So my last slide, please, is then just, so in conclusion, so beyond the risk assessment, do the risk assessment if you've not done that. That's a first step. First of all, just really make sure that we've got the interdependencies. Secondly, update the design standards. Thirdly, really thinking that in recognizing overtly that the natural tendency is towards one of underinvestment, performance-based standards, and then governance for delivery. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. We'll go straight to some questions now. So we had a number of questions come through, and I'm also looking in the chat, which is around really how do you get that balance between or helping, I guess, clients, project operators understand the balance between the investment in climate resilience now and potentially the impacts of that from an operational perspective. How do you sort of help frame that for them and help them sort of make the decisions that are probably going to be more in the long-term interest of an asset? Is there any way we frame it or thinking around that?
I think there's two things. I mean, absolutely, it's aligning that to the business planning and that regulatory settlement. That feels just utterly critical. So to do that has to be a conversation that comes out of call it a climate risk team or a sustainability team or the like. That has to sit with strategy. So that has to be a critical, involved, thought through process. I think the other thing is just building no regret as well. So just building things that are super flexible in terms of new investments as well. If you want to cover every infrastructure eventuality, let's say from sea level rise, you end up potentially with an enormous, more expensive investment. But just then design something so it is easily adaptable to the future and can be easily augmented. And that's modular, plug and play, et cetera, systems that we will see more frequently.
Yeah, so what you're basically saying is a very strong, clear conversation around those so you can actually find the right outcome. And on that as well, I think there's been a couple of questions around how do you actually hand over that risk and make sure, like as a operator, that process is actually happening on your project and you know what you're actually going to get. Are there any key processes around, disclosing or reporting that you're seeing that seem to work well?
I think there's two things. I mean, of course, there is, as you mentioned, Bernadette, a trend towards mandatory reporting, the sort of TCFD, IFRS requirements as well. But I think in terms of managing the risk on projects, I mean, that is just, like any other significant change program in an organization or on a project, it is making sure that is writ large throughout the project, from initial conception through to the scoping of that, and then through into design teams and construction, is just really making sure that there is accountability held all the way through that. And I mean, almost to my last slide on that, like the net zero programs that we're operating, like the Future Ready program, of course, we run in WSP, that's a systematic program, just like any change program, from, who's in charge, breaking it down to the various facets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a clear business process to drive that throughout the organization.
Yeah, right. Okay. And just again, there were a number of questions around sort of how do you assign budgets? How do you prioritize that? I thought there was an interesting one that was actually asking about the sort of ethical considerations that need to be sort of factored in when you are making those decisions around, spending money now and potentially the impacts that might have more broadly on the communities and societies. How do we sort of factor that into those hard-nosed dollar conversations?
Yeah, it's one that for me, again, for those of you that are in sort of regulated infrastructure conversations, I mean, that is absolutely the conversation that you bring back to the regulatory cycle, because that feels really important. That if you put too much resilience spending in, then customers' bills go up more than they might wish to. So yeah, there is absolutely a measured conversation to be having. But yeah, in all of this is about good stakeholder engagement and good planning. And the work, for example, that we did with I have done with a number of the water companies, that's been a thoughtful conversation with customers about what would you pay for, not just on climate resilience but also around net zero as well. And yeah, actually involving them in the measured conversation, I think hopefully then does help address some of the ethical pieces as well.
And I'm wondering, just listening to you talk about the carbon aspect of it as well. I mean, certainly the social cost of carbon is something we are more aware of studies on that. So maybe there does start to become a metric we put around the social aspects of it.
Yeah,
There's
and
been
just thinking, maybe, sorry, Bernard, just to come in as well. I mean, just also thinking about some of the wider benefits. I'm just thinking about some of the works that our teams have been doing in Copenhagen, for example, where we're working with the city authorities, that our teams there have been sort of retrofitting some wonderful blue-green infrastructure. So building more resilience to peak rain in the city centre. That's used an opportunity to bring water courses up to the surface, creating really nice green spaces, parks, which are both making the city much more climate resilient, but also creating some great new amenities and bringing biodiversity back to the city centre as well. And yeah, there's a growing number of examples on that, from wet countries like Copenhagen through to slightly more drier places like Los Angeles.
Yeah, right. No, and I think that's all part of it, isn't it? It's like the system, you've got to, bring people on in lots of different ways and have something that people can open as well. That helps bring the politicians on board. There are a number of questions around assessing methods that we use to effectively assess interdependencies and cascading risks. I'm not sure if you have a thought on that. What do you see? Processes,
there is a good number of processes on that. I mean, again, without going into an enormous amounts of detail, I mean, certainly take a look at some of, for example, just some of the learnings from UK Committee on Climate Change. We wrote the section on assessing interdependent risks as part of our team's work with the CCC. I mean, if just the obvious one is, you can have a super formal methodology on that. It's also just actually thinking about some consequence analysis, particularly for infrastructure organizations or, overall risk assessments. Actually, it is just, you could start with just doing some clear thinking around what if, what's our organization really, really dependent on. I had the pleasure of, if you don't mind a bit of a digression, I had the pleasure of doing quite a lot of work in the whiskey sector. They are a lovely, lovely client. And, as part of the climate risk assessment that we did there, the biggest risk that we identified in that scenario was just the security of barley supply. Whiskey barleys are very resilient. They're a certain strain. They're not just any barley. And genetically virtually identical, highly subject to new pests and viruses from climate risk. That then, that was the consequence analysis, was looking to that, and then a recognition that it's 20 years to develop a new whiskey barley, because they won't go anywhere near GM from harming the brand. They're now well on with that. But yeah, you don't need a huge formal risk assessment. There's a critical interdependency on that before you then get to security of the supply chain and ability to distribute products and energy security and the like.
There's been a couple of questions also around, like, how do you get value as somebody potentially in the private sector, a developer? How do you get value in terms of implementing climate resilience? How do you get that to a point where we might actually be able to capitalize on that from a market perspective? Have you seen any good examples of where that's happened?
So I think there's two scenarios I think to look at. If you're a developer which is build the development and then sell it off as quickly as possible and have no long-term interest, then in reality that probably does take you to a build to code, build to standard perspective. I think where we're working with clients who are much more build and hold, then it becomes much more important. And so in that circumstance, I mean, just some of the obvious ones. I mean, of course, there's flooding, but also quite a lot of thought about how do we combine energy efficiency with also tolerance to future temperatures in the buildings that we're constructing. We would always now be modeling those buildings to a 2050 weather file. I can't comment on Australia, but we've got quite a lot of anecdotal research around people just saying, look, it's not keeping my new condo cold, that it overheats all the time just because it's becomes too hot and there's too much glazing. These are the sorts of things that becomes super relevant if you are if you're building and then you're owning and leasing the buildings.
I was just thinking on that as well. We're seeing certainly some reflections on that as well, within terms of insurance and stuff in projects. If you can actually show that you've got a risk assessment, a good understanding of the impacts, and you've managed even some of those impacts, there is a potential operational cost assistance.
Yeah, it's a great shout, Bernadette. I mean, I think insurance is a really important point for certainly for property as well. And you'll certainly see some properties, even quite new properties, built on floodplains and the like that are uninsurable in parts of the world. And yeah, I mean, obviously that doesn't benefit anybody.
This is actually just on that. There was a really interesting question that came through around that tension between the need to develop into areas that may not necessarily be that great in terms of flooding or maybe bushfire risk, and how you balance that with the fact that we actually need more development, more housing, all of those sort of things. I'm not sure if there's a comment specifically that you give in response to that, but it was a question on how do you balance between that.
I mean, I suppose if the obvious answer is don't, because there's plenty of examples of developments that have been built and then flood out fairly shortly afterwards, or even maybe it's as bad that then causes flooding downstream because the floodplain doesn't have the capacity. I think if you're absolutely going to do that, I suppose then the only other thing is just darn well make sure that your development is flood resilient and can recover. And that can be some really simple things like just putting the electrics a meter higher up the walls of developments, not again where we're developing things near to sea level, again in some of the Nordic countries that we've been working, you're using your ground floor as not something which is critical, but actually you've got most of your living space on level 1 and higher.
All right. There's just a couple of other questions, and I think we'll finish. One was just on one of the challenges, and I definitely experienced this too, when you're working on a project that you are within a network and there's issues with it, and your ability to influence or control that within your project is limited. What what should we be doing, I guess, as people who are working in these type of projects be doing? What's the best thing we can be doing when we're saying, look, we know this is going to get flooded. We do expect at some point there's going to be some activity from the water authority or the coastal authority, whatever it is, but at this point that's an unknown for us, or a hope or a general view that something will happen at some point. Yeah, do you sort of, what should we be doing?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there's a really important need to have an organisation that is looking at city level or regional level resilience and making sure absolutely that they are providing that overarching governance as well. And of course, that's not just for climate. You could take that for net zero and the like as well. So, you know, we're raising the bar in its totality. The example that I might just give you as one in terms of how a development has addressed that would be a development we've just finished. I won't try and pronounce it if you don't mind. In Oslo.
I was going to say it's Nordic somewhere, isn't it?
It's Jokamet or something. Yeah.
Right,
So, but anyway, I don't want to sound really stupid. And in that circumstance, the challenge that our property teams had in this development is that the surrounding stormwater network did not have the capacity to take projected runoff from the development. It was a redevelopment of an existing part of Oslo, and so in that circumstance, the team again, lots of green blue infrastructure, lots of green roofs to slow the flow, slowing the flow down through some storage of stormwater as well on site, so that can then be attenuated, and at the same time also in that circumstance then protecting a metro line that runs next door to the development from flooding as well. So yeah, that's just recognizing you want to have, you know, ideally you have a citywide solution, but there is things that individual developments can do.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, I think there's been so many questions, but we are out of time. So maybe just so reflection or anything, if anybody walks away with anything, I mean, you had your 5 things, but what is it that you know, Australians working in this space should be thinking about? What's our opportunity, do you think? What can we bring to this?
Well, look, I think, you know, the flip side to net zero as being the economic growth of the 21st century, just think about the potential impact to the economy from dangerous climate change, and that's the same for our organizations as well. So for me, the biggest thing that I would say take away from this is, you know, beyond the risk assessment, is just connect that specifically, systematically with your strategic planning process on your project's purposeful conversations. Align those to performance standards and just make sure that there is that governance all the way through. This is not a science program. This becomes an engineering management consultancy conversation informed by the science. And yeah, that I think, Bernadette and everybody, yeah, thank you for joining. I hope that would be the takeaway, I would say, to be making the difference from the risk assessment.
So advocating for standards, advocating for really reflecting that back into how we plan for performance ongoing, all of those sort of things wherever we can. And yeah, excellent. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We are at time. There's been so many questions, and I can see that there's a lot of excellent questions from practitioners who are clearly thinking about this a lot. And thank you, David, for finding the time. Enjoy the rest of your trip around, and I think we'll wrap it from there. Oh, is there anything else? No? Okay,
nope,
great.
We're good.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, bye then.